In the winter of 1938, as Francisco Franco's forces advanced through the rugged mountains of Asturias, Spain, a young American war correspondent named Thomas McKinnon came across something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden away in a remote valley near the village of Pays, he uncovered remnants of what local survivors whispered was the most cursed bloodline in all of Spain. 3 sisters, Elena, Magdalena, and Esperanza Calderón, had not only shared a home, but also a single husband. By doing so, they created what medical experts would later describe as the most genetically isolated family tree in documented European history. For more than 80 years, McKinnon's sealed reports remained locked inside the archives of the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C., stored alongside testimonies that were deemed too disturbing for public release. What happened in that forgotten corner of Asturias between 1895 and 1938 challenges everything we thought we knew about family survival, and reveals the horrifying lengths to which people will go to preserve what they believe is a sacred bloodline. Before we continue with the story of the Calderón sisters, and the terrible discovery that changed one American journalist's life forever, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We uncover chilling, forgotten stories from around the world that, in surprising ways, connect back to American history. And in the comments, tell us, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts who help us bring these buried tales to light, especially those with Spanish or European ancestry who may recognize pieces of these old-world secrets. The mountains of eastern Asturias had long been a place the outside world seemed to overlook. Even as Spain tore itself apart in the brutal civil war of 1936 to 1939, the remote valleys near the Picos de Europa remained largely untouched by the conflict raging across the rest of the country. It was here, in the isolated hamlet of Pang, that the Calderón family had made their home for nearly 3 centuries. Originally arriving from the Basque territories in the 1640s as cattle herders and stonemasons, they built a legacy that would take a very dark turn. By 1895, however, the family had dwindled to a single man, Don Aurelio Calderón, and his 3 daughters, Elena, the eldest at 22, Magdalena, 20, and Esperanza, barely 18. Their mother, Concepcion, had died in childbirth with what would have been a 4th daughter, leaving Aurelio to raise his 3 surviving girls in complete isolation from the handful of families scattered across the valley. The nearest town of any real importance, Cangas de Onís, was a full day's journey by mule across treacherous mountain trails, paths that became impossible during the harsh Asturian winters. Don Aurelio Calderón was a man consumed by obsession, an obsession he called la pureza de sangre, the purity of blood. For years he pored over genealogical records preserved in an old wooden chest that had belonged to his father. Inside were yellowed parchments, marriage certificates, baptismal records, and carefully written family charts that traced the Calderón line across centuries. The Calderóns had lived in this secluded valley for nearly 300 years. Their ancestors had arrived in the 1640s, migrating from the Basque territories as cattle herders and stonemasons. They had settled in Pang, building their stone farmhouse and carving out a life in isolation, generation after generation. While other families moved, married into new bloodlines, or drifted toward towns and cities, the Calderóns remained in their valley, clinging to old ways. By 1895, that ancient family tree had dwindled to Aurelio himself and his 3 daughters, Elena, 22 years old and sharp-eyed, Magdalena, 20, softer in her manner but restless with curiosity, and Esperanza, just 18, youngest and most vulnerable. Their mother, Concepcion, had died during childbirth with what would have been a 4th daughter, leaving Aurelio alone to raise his children in almost complete seclusion. The nearest settlement of significance, Cangas de Onís, lay a full day's journey away by mule. The trails wound through dangerous mountain passes, passages that became impassable once winter snow sealed off the valley. For much of the year, the Calderons were entirely cut off from the outside world. This isolation was not just a circumstance of geography, it was also Aurelio's choice. When Aurelio studied his genealogical charts, pride mixed with dread. He discovered that his family had remained remarkably free of what he called contamination. There were no marriages with Moors during the medieval period, no unions with conversos, the Jewish converts to Christianity, and most importantly, no mixing with local Asturian peasants, whom Aurelio viewed as racially inferior. To him, this was proof of the family's noble heritage. He insisted they were descended from Gothic kings, their blood carrying ancient and sacred properties. But this discovery carried a terrifying consequence. Aurelio was the last surviving male Calderon. If he allowed his daughters to marry outsiders, the bloodline he believed sacred would be diluted forever. If he forbade them to marry at all, the line would end with him. And so, through long dark winters cut off from the world, a third option began to take root in Aurelio's increasingly troubled mind, an option that would echo through the decades and eventually reach the ears of an American journalist 4 decades later. The three sisters grew up believing they were fundamentally different from everyone else. Aurelio filled their heads with stories of noble ancestors and sacred duty. Elena, with her piercing gray eyes, became her father's confidant, helping him expand his genealogical charts. Magdalena, softer and more questioning, sometimes wondered about life beyond the valley, though her father scolded her, insisting curiosity was weakness. Esperanza, the youngest, had been born with a slight limp. Aurelio interpreted it as a mark of ancient nobility, a hereditary sign that appeared only in the purest bloodlines. Their isolation shaped them in ways that horrified outsiders who later heard the tale. By 1895, the Calderón sisters spoke in a dialect nearly incomprehensible to others, a strange blend of archaic Castilian, Asturian, and even fragments of medieval Latin. Their clothing, hand-sewn from patterns handed down across generations, had been out of fashion for decades. But most disturbing of all was their relationship with one another, and with their father. In that lonely farmhouse, ordinary boundaries of family life had blurred. And as the winter of 1895 closed in, Aurelio made a decision that would bind his daughters to a fate darker than any of them could yet imagine. As the harsh winter of 1895 descended upon the valley, Aurelio Calderón summoned his daughters into the main room of their stone farmhouse. The fire burned low, casting shadows across the genealogical charts spread out on the table. It was here that he presented them with what he called their sacred duty. He told them he had found the perfect solution to preserve their bloodline while ensuring its continuation. They would share a single husband, a man named Rodrigo Calderón, whom Aurelio had located in a village near Santander. Rodrigo, he assured them, was a distant cousin of pure Calderón blood, his ancestry traced back through his grandfather to the very same ancestor they all shared. What Aurelio did not reveal was the truth: Rodrigo was not a distant cousin at all. He was Aurelio's own son, born years earlier through his deceased sister, Carmen. That made Rodrigo not only an impostor in the family narrative, but the girl's own half-brother. To conceal this, Aurelio had forged documents with painstaking precision, building a false genealogical trail that made Rodrigo appear as a legitimate cousin. In Aurelio's twisted logic, this arrangement would not only preserve their bloodline, it would purify it even further, concentrating their heritage into a form he believed was closer to perfection. The plan was cold and methodical. Each sister would spend 1 month as Rodrigo's primary wife, while the other 2 served as companions and caretakers. Any children born from these unions would be raised collectively, with their true parentage deliberately obscured to avoid favoritism. To Aurelio, this was not merely marriage, it was a breeding schedule disguised as holy duty. Elena, ever loyal and eager to serve her father's ideals, accepted immediately. Magdalena hesitated, questioning the morality of such an arrangement, but was quickly silenced by Aurelio's theological arguments about divine will and family honor. Esperanza, the youngest, reacted with horror. She saw more clearly than her sisters what was being demanded, but her protests were dismissed as youthful hysteria. By November of 1896, Rodrigo arrived from Santander. He was a hollow-eyed man of 35, marked by hardship, his face weathered far beyond his years. His hands bore the calluses of lifelong labor. Yet there was something unsettling about him, an intensity in his dark eyes and a way of speaking that suggested he knew far more about the Calderón family history than he let on. As the first snow fell, sealing the valley off from the outside world, Rodrigo took his place within the household. The arrangement began exactly as Aurelio had planned. Elena, as the eldest, was given the first month to establish herself as Rodrigo's primary wife. The ceremony that united them was performed by Aurelio himself. It was a strange and unsettling fusion, part Catholic ritual, part family invention, stitched together from fragments of Gothic traditions Aurelio claimed had been passed down for centuries. There were no witnesses, no priest from Cangas to Onis, no civil registration. In the eyes of the church and the state, it was no marriage at all. It was, instead, the beginning of a carefully orchestrated breeding pact, an arrangement that blurred every boundary of morality, family, and faith. That first winter of 1896 to 1897 brought a silence that seemed to swallow the Calderón Valley whole. Snow pressed against the stone walls of the farmhouse, cutting the family off from every path to the outside world. It was during this suffocating isolation that the true horror of Aurelio's plan began to reveal itself, transforming what at first seemed disturbing into something far more sinister. What happened in that first month of the arrangement would haunt the Calderón Valley for decades. Elena, who had always been the most compliant of the sisters, began to change in ways neither Magdalena nor Esperanza could fully understand. She became secretive, whispering with Rodrigo in the corners of the house, her gray eyes glowing with a new intensity. She grew obsessed with their father's genealogical charts, spending long hours copying names and dates, sketching elaborate family trees, and calculating the possible genetic makeup of the children she might bear. During evening gatherings around the fire, Rodrigo began to speak of his past. But his stories were inconsistent, riddled with details that did not match Aurelio's claims of distant kinship. He recalled places near Paines that no supposed cousin should have known. He spoke of events in the valley's history with an intimacy that betrayed deeper roots. And most unsettling of all, he bore Aurelio's unmistakable features, the narrow nose, the cleft chin, and the piercing gray eyes, the very traits Aurelio prized as proof of Calderón purity. Magdalena was the first to sense the truth. During her month as Rodrigo's wife, she began asking pointed questions about his childhood and family. Rodrigo grew evasive. Aurelio grew furious. His violent reactions to Magdalena's suspicions only confirmed what she had begun to fear: something was deeply wrong with the arrangement. It was Esperanza, however, who uncovered the terrible reality. In February of 1897, as a blizzard trapped the family inside for 3 days, she found a cache of letters hidden beneath her father's mattress. They were decades old, written by Aurelio's sister, Carmen, who had died in 1862 shortly after giving birth to an illegitimate son. The dates and details left no doubt: Aurelio himself had fathered the child, Rodrigo. Carmen had died giving birth inside the Calderón farmhouse, and the infant was sent away to be raised by relatives in Santander. Rodrigo grew up believing himself an orphan cousin. But the letters also revealed something darker. For over 5 years, Aurelio had corresponded with Rodrigo, slowly feeding him fragments of the family history, convincing him that his duty was to preserve the bloodline, without ever admitting the truth that he would be marrying his own half-sisters. That night, Esperanza confronted her father. Her words spilled out in horror, naming what she knew this was: incest, abuse, and a plan years in the making. Aurelio's response was chilling. With calm precision, he dismissed her outrage, insisting that normal taboos applied only to ordinary people. For families as ancient and pure as the Calderóns, he argued, different rules applied. What outsiders would call incest, Aurelio called genetic refinement. What others would condemn as abuse, he proclaimed a sacred duty. He insisted the children born from this union would be living proof, beings of intelligence, beauty, and strength, destined to surpass ordinary humanity. To him, this was the perfection God intended before sin corrupted creation. Esperanza realized then there was no escape. The snow had sealed them in. Even if she fled in spring, she had no money, no allies, and no knowledge of life beyond the valley. And worse, her sisters were already showing signs of pregnancy. The nightmare was irreversible. So she made a choice. Rather than run, she would document everything. Esperanza began keeping meticulous records, daily notes on family life, the progress of her sisters' pregnancies, and the strange behaviors that began to surface. Her journals, hidden in corners of the farmhouse, would one day become the most important testimony of what unfolded behind those stone walls. By the autumn of 1897, the first generation of Calderón children was born. Elena delivered twins, a boy and a girl, Alonso and Concepcion. Magdalena gave birth to a single daughter, whom she named Carmen, after the aunt she had never known. The births were brutal. Aurelio himself acted as midwife. No outside doctor could be summoned during the snow season. And from the very beginning, the children bore the marks of their origin. Alonso had a pronounced underbite that made speech difficult. Concepcion's fingers were webbed, fused at the joints. Carmen seemed the healthiest, but her hearing was severely impaired, forcing the family to invent hand signals for communication. Physical abnormalities were only part of it. By age 3, the children displayed behaviors that disturbed even Esperanza. They were obsessed with bloodlines, asking about ancestry and charts instead of playing games. They ignored childish amusements, spending hours staring at genealogical trees pinned to the farmhouse walls. Worst of all, they seemed to understand instinctively that their family was a secret, something to be guarded, never spoken of to outsiders. By 1900, more children had been born. The household expanded into a growing brood of Calderón offspring, 8 in total by 1905. Parentage was deliberately obscured. Rodrigo continued his rotations among the sisters, while Aurelio oversaw the process with the cold detachment of a scientist. The children, raised in isolation, were indoctrinated from birth. They received no formal schooling, no visits from priests or doctors, no contact with other children. They learned to read and write from the very genealogies Aurelio treasured. They studied mathematics only through the calculations of lineage. Their understanding of the world was shaped entirely by Aurelio's lectures on purity and superiority. And as Alonso, the firstborn male, approached puberty in 1910, Aurelio had already chosen him to take over as the next patriarch of the family. By the year 1910, the Calderón household had transformed from a single family into a closed community of its own design. 8 children filled the farmhouse, and more were on the way. Rodrigo continued his rotations among the 3 sisters, but the arrangement had evolved into something far more complex. The older children, indoctrinated since birth, were already participating in what Aurelio called family planning. It was Alonso, the firstborn son, who stood at the center of Aurelio's vision for the second generation. Though marked by a severe underbite and difficulty speaking, Aurelio declared him the heir to the patriarch's role. From the age of 10, Alonso was groomed for leadership, taught to see his sisters and cousins not as family in the ordinary sense, but as future breeding partners. The other children, too, grew up with this perspective. Discussions of bloodlines, combinations, and purity replaced the normal games of childhood. By adolescence, they spoke casually about which cousin or sibling they might be paired with, evaluating one another like livestock. For them, this was not shame, it was sacred duty. By the late 1910s, the Calderón family had entered its second generation of inbreeding. Alonso, reaching puberty, began fathering children by both his sister Concepcion and his cousin Carmen. Within a few years, new offspring were born, children whose deformities were even more severe than those of the first generation. Some were born with club feet. Others with skeletal malformations that twisted their posture or shortened their limbs. Several showed signs of profound developmental delays, unable to speak or walk properly even at advanced ages. Infant mortality soared. Roughly half the children did not survive their first year of life. But to Aurelio, these were not failures. He dismissed the deaths and deformities as the inevitable weeding out of weak stock. In his warped logic, the children who perished were simply chaff, unfit vessels for the purity of the Calderón blood. Those who survived were declared chosen, proof that the family's mission was righteous. The sisters, now aging into their 30s and 40s, endured one pregnancy after another. Their bodies weakened, but Aurelio pushed them onward, claiming their suffering was part of a divine burden. Magdalena, who had once questioned her father, had long since fallen silent. Elena, ever dutiful, enforced Aurelio's will among the younger children. And Esperanza, who had uncovered the truth years earlier, continued to document everything. Her hidden journals grew thick with entries, notes on births, deformities, deaths, and the strange psychology shaping each new child. By 1920, the Calderón family had grown into a clan of nearly 30 individuals, all descended from Rodrigo and the three sisters. The farmhouse had been expanded with crude additions to house them all. The once simple stone dwelling now resembled a compound, rooms branching like veins, corridors added without plan, and walls lined with genealogical charts that mapped every intermarriage in suffocating detail. That same year, Aurelio, now in his 70s, still ruled with undiminished zeal. His once sharp body had grown frail, but his mind remained fixed on his mission. He saw in Alonso in the second generation not the collapse of a family, but the fulfillment of his design. To him, every deformity was a necessary step, every death a sacrifice, and every surviving child a step closer to perfection. The theology of the Calderón household hardened. Children were taught that those who died in infancy had simply been called back to God, their genetic mission complete. Survivors were told they were chosen by Providence to carry forward the bloodline. The idea of free will did not exist within the compound. Every role was predetermined by ancestry and Aurelio's charts. As the 1920s progressed, the outside world modernized rapidly. Automobiles appeared in Spanish towns, electricity reached rural villages, and cities grew restless with social change. But inside the Calderón Valley, time remained frozen. Their language drifted further from modern Spanish, warped by archaic words and pseudo-scientific jargon. Their clothing, still sewn from patterns a half-century old, marked them as relics from another age. And their worldview, obsessed with blood purity and breeding, set them apart as something no longer recognizably human. In 1930, Aurelio died at the age of 85, his body finally succumbing though his ideology lived on. His death marked the end of the founding patriarch, but not the end of his program. Leadership of the family passed to his descendants, most prominently Alonso, though his intellect was limited by the very inbreeding Aurelio had championed. The role of true strategist fell to his sister Concepcion, who inherited not only Aurelio's obsession but also his calculating intelligence. It was under Concepcion's rule that the Calderón family's practices became even more systematic, more ritualized, and far more disturbing. The death of Aurelio Calderón in 1930 might have ended the family's grim experiment, but instead it unleashed a new phase, one that was colder, more calculated, and even more disturbing. Leadership passed first, in name, to Alonso, now 33. He was Aurelio's grandson, the firstborn male of the new line, and the child who had been groomed since birth to carry the patriarch's role. But Alonso was hardly the leader his grandfather imagined. Years of concentrated inbreeding had left their mark on him. He suffered from premature balding, a severe tremor in his hands, and teeth that had never fully developed. His speech remained difficult, his thoughts often scattered. It quickly became clear that while he was the figurehead, Alonso lacked the intellectual ability to manage the complex genealogical charts and calculations that Aurelio had used to direct every union. Into this vacuum stepped his sister, Concepcion. Cold, intelligent, and utterly devoted to the ideology of La Pureza de Sangre, she became the true strategist of the Calderón clan. Where Aurelio had been driven by obsession and warped pride, Concepcion ruled with a chilling sense of order. Under her control, the family's breeding program became more organized, and more ruthless than ever before. She introduced what she called breeding schedules. These were detailed timetables dictating which family members would reproduce, and with whom, based on careful analysis of prior offspring. She kept records not only of physical traits but also of intelligence, temperament, and what she termed bloodline indicators. Children were measured, tested, and rated like livestock. Their futures were determined not by love or chance, but by Concepcion's cold calculations. By the mid-1930s, the third generation of Calderón children numbered over 20. The effects of 4 decades of inbreeding were now impossible to ignore. Physical deformities were rampant: cleft palates, club feet, skeletal malformations, and twisted spines were common. Some children could not walk, others could not feed themselves. Mental disabilities ranged from mild learning delays to severe impairments that left certain family members entirely dependent on others for survival. Yet within the compound, these afflictions were not seen as failures. Concepción dismissed them as necessary sacrifices. The weak, she argued, were God's way of refining the line. Those who survived their deformities were celebrated as chosen vessels, their suffering framed as proof of divine selection. But perhaps the most horrifying change was not physical, it was psychological. The third generation had never known a world beyond the Calderón compound. They were raised from birth in an environment where brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, and uncles were viewed not as family, but as future breeding partners. The very concept of incest meant nothing to them. By adolescence, they spoke openly about pairings and offspring. They discussed one another's traits with the clinical detachment of scientists, debating which unions might improve the line. Their indoctrination was complete. What any outsider would see as unthinkable, they embraced with enthusiasm, believing they were fulfilling a sacred mission. Their culture drifted further into isolation. The language of the Calderón household evolved into a strange dialect, an incomprehensible blend of archaic Spanish, Asturian fragments, and genetic terminology borrowed from Aurelio's charts. Clothing remained handmade, still following 19th-century patterns, making them appear as relics even when glimpsed by chance. Most disturbing of all was their perception of time and history. The world beyond the mountains was modernizing rapidly. Spain entered the turbulent years of the Second Republic, and civil unrest grew toward civil war. But inside the Calderón Valley, life remained frozen in Aurelio's era. Their calendars were marked not by holidays or political events, but by breeding cycles and birth records. It was during this time, as the 1930s unfolded, that Esperanza, now in her 50s, made a fateful decision. She had spent decades secretly documenting the family's activities, journals that recorded every birth, every death, every deformity, and every ritual. But she knew that unless these records reached the outside world, they would die with her. And so Esperanza began to take risks. She wrote messages in standard Spanish, not the family dialect, and left them hidden in places where hunters, surveyors, or passing merchants might stumble across them. These notes spoke vaguely of an ancient community that had preserved forgotten traditions, inviting curious outsiders to visit. She avoided exposing the full horror, instead planting just enough intrigue that someone might come looking. It was a desperate gamble. Esperanza could not escape the compound herself. Decades of isolation and complicity had tied her too tightly to the family. But perhaps someone from beyond the mountains might one day arrive to uncover the truth. She could not have known that war was coming, and that her scattered messages would eventually lead not to quiet intervention, but to the most chilling discovery of the Spanish Civil War. By the late 1930s, Spain was tearing itself apart. The civil war between Franco's nationalists and the Republican forces had consumed the nation in bloodshed. Cities burned, villages emptied, and entire regions were drawn into the violence. Yet in the remote valleys of Asturias, where the Calderón family had lived for centuries, the fighting remained distant. The mountains shielded them, as if war itself recoiled from their cursed ground. But even the most isolated corners of Spain could not remain untouched forever. In 1937, a patrol of the Guardia Civil was dispatched into the high country around the Picos de Europa. Their mission was simple: search for Republican holdouts rumored to be hiding in the valleys. What they found instead would become one of the most disturbing footnotes of the entire war. As they passed through the hamlet of Pang, the patrol came across an old chapel. Inside, tucked between hymnals and discarded candles, they discovered a folded scrap of paper. Written in clear, careful Spanish, the message was unlike anything they had seen before. It spoke cryptically of an ancient family hidden in the valley, a people untouched by modern times, who had preserved a purity the outside world has long forgotten. The note ended with a plea: if you wish to understand the truth of Spain's blood, come and see what we have preserved. To the soldiers, it sounded like a trap, perhaps propaganda left by Republican partisans. Yet curiosity gnawed at them. They showed the note to their commander, who decided to send a small detachment to investigate. What began as a diversion would soon spiral into a discovery that none of them could ever fully explain. The patrol followed the directions hinted at in the letter, winding their way through treacherous mountain paths until they reached the secluded Calderón compound. At first glance, it appeared abandoned, stone walls weathered, smoke absent from the chimney. But inside, they found signs of life: clothing that looked a century out of date, genealogical charts covering the walls, and journals written in a strange hybrid language. Then came the voices. Children's voices, dozens of them, muttering from the shadows in dialects the soldiers could barely recognize. When the family finally emerged, what the patrol saw chilled them to the core. The Calderón children, ranging from toddlers to young adults, bore the unmistakable signs of generations of inbreeding. Twisted limbs, misshapen skulls, glassy stares, and vacant smiles. Some shuffled awkwardly, others crawled instead of walked. Yet all of them carried an unsettling intensity in their eyes. The patrol's captain ordered the family gathered for questioning. The adults complied reluctantly, speaking in a language halfway between archaic Castilian and something older, almost medieval. When pressed, Concepcion introduced herself as the leader of the household. She insisted they were living by divine mandate, preserving the blood of the Gothic kings. She spoke of charts, purity, and destiny. Among the family, one figure stood apart: Esperanza, now gray-haired and frail. She tried to speak to the soldiers in proper Spanish, her voice trembling. She begged them to understand the truth of what had been happening, to take her writings and deliver them to authorities outside the valley. Her words hinted at decades of secrecy, of children born and lost, of rituals carried out under the guise of holy duty. The soldiers were stunned. They had come searching for guerrillas, but instead stumbled onto something that felt older than the war itself, an ancient madness thriving in isolation. Unsure what to do, they escorted the Calderóns down from the valley and reported their findings. It was this chain of events that drew the attention of Thomas McKinnon, the young American war correspondent attached to Franco's forces. Curious about the patrol's bizarre reports, he traveled to Asturias in the winter of 1938. What he found there, the broken remnants of the Calderón family, Esperanza's journals, and the medical examinations that followed, would haunt him for the rest of his life. And though McKinnon filed his reports, the most disturbing testimonies were quietly sealed away in Washington, never meant for public eyes. When Thomas McKinnon arrived in Asturias in the winter of 1938, he expected to cover the final pushes of Franco's campaign. Instead, he was led by the Guardia Civil to a series of makeshift holding quarters where the surviving Calderón family members had been gathered. The sight stunned him. Dozens of individuals, ranging from infants to adults in their 20s, sat huddled together. Their clothing looked like relics from another century. Their speech was fragmented, half archaic Castilian, half incomprehensible dialect. And their appearances. McKinnon later wrote that it was as if he had stepped into a medieval painting of the damned: twisted spines, misshapen skulls, cleft palates, and a haunted uniformity of gray eyes staring out at him. The Spanish authorities, unsure how to handle the situation, called in doctors from Oviedo and Santander. For the first time, the Calderóns were examined by trained physicians. The results horrified even seasoned medical professionals. The children and young adults displayed a range of congenital disorders consistent with extreme consanguinity, skeletal malformations, severe dental deformities, clubfoot, and developmental impairments. Nearly half the younger children were judged unfit for independent survival. Psychologists were brought in as well. They noted that the Calderons possessed intelligence in uneven bursts. Some children could recite genealogies back 10 generations with flawless memory, yet could not identify basic objects from the outside world. Others displayed obsessive behaviors, arranging stones into family trees, repeating ancestral names for hours, or drawing endless charts of imagined bloodlines. Their entire worldview revolved around ancestry, purity, and duty. When questioned about their family practices, Concepcion spoke calmly, almost proudly. She explained that their unions were ordained by God, a mission passed down from Aurelio himself. She used terms like purification and sacrifice, dismissing deformities as divine trials. In her mind, the Calderons were not broken, they were chosen. Esperanza, by contrast, used the opportunity to pass McKinnon her hidden journals. She had carried them in bundles of cloth, written over decades in careful Spanish. Within those pages, McKinnon discovered the detailed history of the family, the Pact of 1895, the deception of Rodrigo's identity, the birth defects, the deaths, and the obsessive rituals of Aurelio. Reading them late into the night, McKinnon realized he was holding a record of systematic, multi-generational incest, unparalleled in modern European history. It was, as one doctor later told him, a controlled breeding experiment disguised as a family. The Spanish authorities debated what to do. Some argued the family should be institutionalized. Others thought they should be quietly dispersed into rural orphanages to disappear from memory. In the end, the chaos of war made decisive action impossible. Franco's regime had little interest in publicizing something so bizarre, especially in a country already fractured by ideology. The Calderón case was treated as a curiosity, an embarrassing footnote to be filed away and forgotten. McKinnon, however, refused to let it go. He sent copies of Esperanza's journals and his own field notes back to the U.S. State Department. The material was archived in Washington, but marked as restricted, too disturbing for public release. In his dispatches, McKinnon described the Calderón family as a living ruin of human isolation, evidence of how ideology and fanaticism could warp not just a household, but an entire bloodline. He left Spain shaken, carrying with him memories he would never escape. In interviews decades later, McKinnon confessed that no battlefield horror compared to what he had seen in that valley, the children staring with gray eyes that seemed both ancient and empty, repeating genealogies as if they were prayers. For him, the Calderons were not simply victims of circumstance. They were a mirror, reflecting the extremes of human obsession and the terrible lengths people will go to preserve what they believe must never be lost. In the months following the Calderón discovery, the Spanish Civil War pushed onward. Villages burned, soldiers marched, and the attention of the world turned to Franco's brutal rise. In that chaos, the story of a hidden valley in Asturias faded into obscurity. The Calderons, once the focus of stunned physicians and Guardia Civil reports, were quietly scattered. Some of the children were placed in rural orphanages, stripped of their family name. Others were institutionalized, their medical files sealed under Franco's regime. A few simply disappeared, swallowed by the anonymity of war. Concepcion, who had ruled the household with cold authority, reportedly died in custody around 1939. The exact circumstances of her death remain unclear, whether from illness, neglect, or deliberate silencing. Alonso, the figurehead heir, is believed to have perished during the early 1940s, his frail body finally collapsing under years of congenital weakness. Only Esperanza left a lasting mark. Though she never escaped the stigma of her family's history, her journals became the backbone of Thomas McKinnon's sealed reports. Page after page of her careful handwriting laid bare 4 decades of secrecy, abuse, and obsession. She wrote not only of names and births, but of her own horror, her guilt, and her desperate attempts to record everything so that, one day, the truth would be known. In Washington, McKinnon's dispatches were quietly catalogued by the U.S. State Department. Alongside Esperanza's journals, they were classified as restricted documents. Officially, they were filed under anthropological anomalies, but in reality, they were considered too disturbing for public release. For more than 80 years, they have remained buried in archives, an unspeakable story locked away in government vaults. Occasionally, whispers of the Calderón family surfaced among historians and journalists digging into obscure corners of the Spanish Civil War. But without access to the sealed records, their accounts were dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. The world moved on, leaving the Calderóns to linger only in rumor, their story almost lost. Almost. Because thanks to the fragments preserved in McKinnon's notes, and the rare testimonies that escaped the archives, we can still glimpse what happened in that valley, how a family cut off from the world became consumed by obsession, how ideology masqueraded as faith, and how purity became corruption. The Calderóns are more than a grotesque historical footnote. They are a warning. A warning about isolation, about fanaticism, and about the terrible things humans can justify when convinced they are protecting something sacred. And yet, their story has remained almost entirely unknown, until now. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of listener who helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? We love seeing our community of mystery enthusiasts grow, especially those of you with Spanish or European ancestry who may recognize fragments of these buried tales. This has been the story of the Calderón sisters, and the cursed bloodline hidden in the mountains of Asturias. A family whose obsession with purity led them into darkness, and whose secrets were almost lost to history. But not anymore.